So this video will be more of a conceptual one, but what I want to talk about in this video is approaching your mixes as part of the musical process and how having an end goal in mind will help you make better mixes. So first we'll discuss this idea with some examples, talking about some various different ideas as well, and then I'll show you a practical example of this and this demo mix that we're working on. So while it's easy to get carried away with the technical side of audio mixing, you want to remember that the end goal is to help the song, either your own song that you're working on that you also produced, or a client's song that you're working on as a mix. So the first concept that I want to discuss is viewing your mixing as part of the songwriting process, rather than something that just happens after everything is written and everything is produced. So you almost want to view this as if you were the second producer of a track. The mixing process should be in service of the music and the story that songwriter is trying to tell. So not just in terms of making things sound nice and balanced, which is part of the mixing process, but in terms of how you can adjust the song sonically to heighten the musical experience for the listener. So obviously you'd want to check with the client before doing something super drastic like adjusting the arrangement, but keep this idea in mind, that your role as a mix engineer is to heighten the song and to heighten the musicality and story of everything. So take for example the song When the Levee Breaks by Led Zeppelin. The drums in this song have a really gigantic sound because of the way that they were recorded and mixed. This recording and mixing decision dictates the entire musical feel of the song and adds to the musical story that the song tells. If you're unfamiliar with the way that this track was recorded, they recorded these drums in a rather large stairwell in the studio that they were working in, which gave these drums this gigantic, really intense, almost like slap delay reverb sound. So imagine if these same drums were recorded on this song with a really close mic'd setup in a studio room that had a really tight sounding room reverb. This would totally change the musical feel of this song, and this would change the musical story that's being told from the perspective of the songwriters. It would go from being this very epic, very driven sounding story to being just kind of a generic rock song. So the best mixing engineers keep this idea in mind, that each song has a story that you're trying to tell, and you can enhance that story through the sonic quality of your mixes. So the decisions that you're making as a mix engineer can heighten the musical story and experience for the listener. So to take this idea a step further, let's use the example of a singer-songwriter song. Let's say that there is just a few guitars in this track and there's a voice. And the subject matter that the singer is singing about is something like a breakup or how alone they are in a certain time. Now what you could do as a mix engineer is just balance the song and make sure that everything sounds nice and tight, the compression and equalization curves are nice and balanced, and just call it a day. But what you could do is get more creative and really take things to the next level musically by adding in some strategic effects, and these strategic effects would be used to heighten the overall musical story of that song. So what you could do, for example, is add a reverb only to the voice, and keep the guitars super dry. This would make the singer sound like they're singing in a rather large cavernous space alone. This not only sounds cool because reverb just sounds nice, it'll musically aid the song by helping tell the story that songwriter is trying to tell. Now the listener feels the isolation that the singer is communicating with the lyrics and their performance because of one simple mixing change, putting that singer alone in a rather large cavernous space, and having all the other elements around them be totally dry without that cavernous reverb. So this creative use of effects gives us a unique storytelling device while we're mixing. Reverb won't work for every song in this way, but that's just an idea of how you can approach things. So while you're mixing a track, I'd recommend first identifying the story that the songwriter is trying to tell, then think about how you can enhance that story that the songwriter is trying to tell by using strategic uses of effects and by mixing the song in a certain way. So now let's go ahead and look at a practical example of this demo track that we've been working with throughout the last few videos. You can always download the stems with the course resources if you'd like to follow along with the mixdown and try out your own mixes on these stems. So first, let's identify some key attributes of this song and try to frame the track in terms of a story as much as we can. So let's go ahead and just take a listen to the chorus section. So here we have these really driving drums that are kind of the whole backbone of the track, and they're not super aggressive like rock or heavy metal drums, and they feel like they're kind of going somewhere. So what we may want to do with these drums is mix them in a way that's a bit more lively, that has a nice bounce to it, and a way that compresses the drums in a way that's not super intense. There's also no vocals in this track, which can be an obvious cue as to what the musical piece is about, but let's go ahead and listen to those electric guitars that are kind of hanging out in the background. So these guitars sound rather lonesome and longing. They're kind of helpful, but not exactly happy sounding. So between these two elements, the drums and electric guitars, we start to see a little bit of a musical story. So if you're writing the song that you're working on, this process will definitely be a lot easier to identify because you'll be the one composing the track and you'll know what it's about. But it can be helpful to give the track a bit of a narrative, even if you don't know exactly what the subject matter of the song is that you're mixing for a client. You can even discuss this with the songwriter as well. So you can have a session where you sit down with them and discuss what they have as their musical vision for this track and where they kind of see it going and what they'd like to communicate through their song. So here, let's make a few strategic mixing decisions. Go ahead and jump onto those electric guitars, and let's play up that lonesome and longing feel that these guitars have. Let's add in a nice spacey sounding reverb that kind of feel like these guitars are sitting alone in a desert to play up kind of that musical feel of everything. So you could use any reverb here. I'll just grab one of my favorites, which is the Pro R from FabFilter. But we're not using this for any specific reason, I just rather like the way it sounds. Just trying to show you the example here that we're working with. So let's go ahead and make that nice and chorusy, so it sounds kind of watery. And then we want to make sure that these sound nice and kind of far away and distant because of the way that they sound musically. So let's push the distance all the way to far. Maybe bump the space up just a little bit so the reverb's a bit bigger. And then we could bring that down to about 25 or so, just something a bit more reasonable. So now we've taken those guitars and we've kind of put them in this acoustic space. It helps them feel a bit more lonesome and longing. So in context of the whole mix, it sounds like this. So it's a bit more subtle of a change, but this is playing up the musical story of this song. So we can kind of use the different elements as contextual clues as to how we mix our track. Rather than just thinking about what would sound cool, we could think about our mixing process as what would best aid the song from a musical perspective, rather than just try to make it sound cool. Next, let's go ahead and go over to those drums and add in some compression. We can open those up and they just sound like this. So these kind of feel like they're moving forward in almost this marching fashion. So like they're moving on to something different. So whenever I go to compress my drums, I want to have something that's nice and bouncy and not overly squashed and intense and in your face, because it will add more of an aggressive feel to the drums, which is totally different than what's musically happening in the song. So let me show you both of those examples, the more aggressive drums and then something a bit more casual and driving. So let's hop over, grab the glue compressor. And let's first create some really intense compression. So let's go ahead and move the attack up here. Maybe do something a bit slower on the release so they're super punchy. Bring that threshold down to about -37 or so. You can also crank that makeup gain because it could be rather intense compression. This is definitely way too compressed here. I'm just trying to show you for the sake of an example. So on its own, it sounds kind of cool. It's very compressed and very intense. It sounds more like a rock song or something a bit more heavy. But listen to what that sounds like in context of the mix. These drums feel way too aggressive, punchy, and in your face, and musically this just doesn't really make sense in terms of the overall track. If the musical story is a bit more driving, a bit more lonesome, and a bit more longing, then these intense drums that are totally smashing the listener in the face don't really make sense contextually. Now listen to what these drums sound like whenever we do something a bit more reasonable. So we'll make that attack a bit slower. We'll make that release at about 0.4 or so. We can leave the ratio where it's at, maybe about -15.9 or so. And take this makeup gain down to about 2.38. And on its own, it just sounds like this. So we're just giving those drums a bit more bounce and a bit more life. Listen to what this sounds like in context of the overall song. So in context of the track, this makes a lot more sense as a mixing change because it keeps those drums feeling nice and bouncy and like they're going somewhere rather than being something that's very aggressive and very in your face. So we could use some context clues from the track and the story that it's trying to tell to figure out what type of compression settings we would use on our drums. So this idea of mixing with an end goal in mind, knowing where you want to musically take the song, will give you mixes that are a bit more creative and will also help you musically tell the story that the songwriter is trying to tell through their songwriting. So this tip is a little bit esoteric, but I found that my favorite mixes and favorite mix engineers use this approach to create mixes that feel as though they're part of the songwriting and production process, rather than just someone who's going at the very end of the track and balancing everything to make it sound nice and clean. So give this technique a try on your next mix, and by practicing this idea, it'll help open up new options for your mixes and can really help guide your process as you're working on a track for a client or working on one of your own songs.